Good evening, and thank you for joining us for a night of great information related to substance use disorder. The Central Michigan Recovery and Education Network welcomes you. I am Scott Sexton, an assistant professor in the College of Pharmacy. This is the first night of a two-night educational event titled Prevent, Treat, Recover, an Interprofessional Approach to Substance Use Disorder. Tonight, we will begin with a keynote message delivered by Dr. Susan DeVries Miller, titled Becoming Comfortable with the Uncomfortable. This event will be from 6 to 6:30 p.m. And in this session, you will learn how to identify how substance use disorder and opioid use disorder impact the patients that we serve, techniques to decrease stigma in SUD and OUD, and how to become more involved. Following the keynote delivery, there will be a Q&A panel with, again, Dr. Susan DeVries Miller, Shelby Pash, Stephen Johnson, Jeffrey Stoll, and Taylor Gibson. This is an opportunity to ask the experts the questions that you have. Do you want to know more about how SUD and OUD may have an impact on your profession? Ask our panel. We're here to help. Allow me to introduce our keynote speaker before we begin. Susan DeVries Miller is an associate professor and pharmacist who practices ambulatory care through Ferris State University at Cherry Health Services in Grand Rapids. Susan worked in mental health and specialized foster care for several years, pursued substance use disorder education, and attained her final degree of PharmD from Ferris State University. Susan completed a PGY1 residency with Meyer, Ferris State University, and Pfizer. She currently holds a full-time faculty position with Ferris State University's College of Pharmacy, and she's a faculty advisor for Ferris Pharmacy and MSU medical students in the Engaged Partners Refugee Program and health outreach programs in underserved communities in Kent County. Susan volunteers at the Grand Rapids Red Project and currently serves on their board of directors. She serves on the Kent County Opioid Task Force, Kent County Refugee Health Work Group, Ferris State University Rural Opioid Prevention Network, the State of Michigan DUR Board, and Kent County Pharmacist Association Board. She serves as the chair of Michigan Pharmacy Foundation Board of Trustees, and she collaborates with public health and pharmacy colleagues on health disparities and cultural awareness. Please join me in welcoming tonight's keynote speaker, Dr. DeVries Miller.
Thank you, Scott. Of course, I'm going to mess up the technology already. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here this evening. One of the things that I didn't share with everyone in that introduction is that I was a social worker for 13 years, focused mainly in the mental health and substance use disorder. My passion really is working with persons that are underserved. I'm really an advocate, especially in harm reduction and substance and opioid use disorder. I don't have any conflict of interest tonight, and this topic is exactly what Scott said, becoming comfortable with the uncomfortable. And we do have the 3 objectives that he talked about, and due to time, I'm not going to review them. I really just want us to have a really general overview this evening. These are talks that I usually give an hour to 2 hours. So tonight I'm really quickly just going to go through a ton of information. And then if you have questions, we can always go through that. We know that there's a lot of drugs out there that are being misused. In 2016, there was an estimated 48.5 million people in the US, about 18% of persons that are 12 and older that used illicit drugs. This means prescription drugs, it means cocaine, including crack, heroin, hallucinogens, inhalants, and methamphetamine, as well as the misuse of prescription drugs. Reported prevalence of illicit drug in the past year, so this was also in 2016, was still, again, the marijuana is a highly misused or illicit drug. And when I say illicit drug, it means it's still scheduled by the DEA under Controlled Substance Act. These are illegal drugs. I know many state and local areas have allowed marijuana to become legal, but under the DEA, it's still considered an illicit drug. So marijuana, cocaine, and meth, the prescriptions that are typically misused are pain relievers and prescription stimulants, those that are used for attention deficit disorder or for stimulants for depressions. It could be a prescription tranquilizer or also prescription sedatives. Heroin is misused frequently, as well as pain relievers. For hospitalizations in 2016, we know that there are over 300,000 hospitalizations of non-fatal drug poisonings. Again, opioids including heroin, methadone. It also includes cocaine and methamphetamines. And we know that in 2015, there was over 500,000 emergency department visits for all drug-related poisonings. Same medications or drugs that are typically found in those patients. One thing that I really encourage people to do, especially when we're talking about stigma and substance use disorder and opioid use disorder, know your drugs, know your street drugs. So when you are working with people, whether you're a pharmacist, you're a nurse, you're a social worker, you're in criminal justice, whatever it is that your degree is in or what you're studying to be, even if you're a business and you're working with persons who use substances, know your drugs and the street names. So I'm just going to go through these really quickly. Cocaine, it's a stimulant. We know a lot of people have misused and have a substance use disorder due to cocaine. Psychostimulants would include methamphetamine, ecstasy, as well as some of those prescription stimulants. We know around 6 million people misused the prescription stimulants in 2016. Marijuana, as I said earlier, is a drug that is considered to be a street drug or illicit. There are many persons in the United States that have a marijuana use disorder, and that is usually shown by having a clinically significant impairment, including health problems, persistent or increasing use, or failure to meet major responsibilities at work, school, or home. Fentanyl is one that we really need to keep our eyes on because this is where we see a lot of our opioid overdoses. There's a lot of fentanyl analogs out there that are getting into our drugs. So fentanyl is very potent. It's usually mixed, or you can even say when you're buying heroin, most of the time you're going to get fentanyl or fentanyl analog in the streets. We do have a lot of mixing of substances. I'm going to talk about that when we talk about the 4 different waves of the current waves of drug use. The two words at the end, the goofball and the speedball, really important for you to know because they're being misused a lot. I've actually done a lot, I had to reverse a patient that was using goofball. That person was using opioid and methamphetamines. There's speedball, which is an opioid plus a cocaine. So really understanding that our patient, can be used by our patients. So we know that historically that there's been 3 distinct waves of the opioid overdoses in America. Started in the 90s with the prescription opioid overdoses. We saw an increased number of prescriptions, started leading to overdose. 2010, we saw a marked increase in heroin deaths. 2013, we saw a huge increase in the fentanyl analogs, the synthetic opioids. And what's really interesting is now we have a 4th wave, and it's been since about May of 2017 where we're seeing that polysubstance use that I just spoke about a moment ago. They're calling it gray death. It's usually a gray, almost concrete looking substance that is either inhaled or injected, and it can include a mixture of a fentanyl or fentanyl analog, heroin, some prescription opioids, benzos, cocaine, meth, or prescription amphetamines. So we know that it's really toxic and it can kill people. So let's look at some of those trends. The first wave, we talked about the high prescription numbers. You can see here in 2006 where we were still climbing up in the number of opioid prescriptions being prescribed by providers to about 2012 where we started seeing a drastic decrease. And not just in a decrease in the number of prescriptions, but a decrease in the overall morphine milliequivalents. In 2017, we were seeing that there was about 74 prescriptions per 100 people. It used to be more than that. So that's a good thing. Like, it's definitely come down quite a bit. We used to say that for every 100 people in the room, we'd have more than enough to give every single person a prescription. Now we're just saying that only 74 out of 100 people has a prescription for an opioid in the state of Michigan. It still remains a problem, but it has definitely gotten less. Here's just some of those drugs you can see from 1999, where we had the prescriptions. In 2010, you can see where we have that start increase of the heroin. You can see my hands, they're going upward for the heroin. 2013, you can see the dark blue line where we have the increase of the synthetic opioids and other methadone, other than methadone. But you can also see that we have the heroin, we have the synthetic opioids, we have natural, we have all kinds of substances being misused during that time frame, which increases our opioid overdose. This is the number of deaths that we have seen from 1999 to 2019. You can see that, again, the synthetic opioids, other than methadone, which is primarily our fentanyl and fentanyl analogs, is that peachy orange line at the top. That's where we're seeing the most of the deaths from. But we still have the psychostimulant with abuse potential, primarily the methamphetamine. We're having cocaine, some prescription opioids. Antidepressants have increased a little bit. The benzodiazepines increased for a while. They're slowly coming down. We know we have a decrease in those prescriptions as well. In those years from 1999 to 2018, over 750,000 people died from a drug overdose. That's a lot of people. The 67,367 people are the number of people that died in 2018 per the CDC. And these are caused by the drug overdoses. We thought that was going to be our high point. Unfortunately, it wasn't. We have over 81,000 people that died from May 2019 to June 2020. We know that we had COVID that impacted this a great deal, that we didn't have resources. We had people not being able to go to treatment. We had people not going to facilities to get help, people not going to see their providers, people not going to get naloxone. People were alone. I cannot tell you the number of people that I personally know that had been so safe. And when I say safe, that means they were using the harm reduction techniques that they know, that they were using naloxone. And so when they were around people, they were able to prevent death. But so many people during COVID were using alone and unable to give themselves naloxone and ended up dying. So we have more than 81,000 people during a very difficult time frame. You can see the number of people from January of 2015 all the way into 2020, that short amount of time frame from 2019 to 2020, how many more people we lost. It's really interesting because it depends on how people get it, how they're most likely to die. So if I had a lot of time tonight, I would go through that. We know the fact that if people get prescriptions or from a family friend that is prescription based, they have less of a chance of dying from an overdose. But when we know that people bought from a drug dealer or a stranger, they have a higher incidence of dying from an overdose. What does this tell us? This tells us that there are people that are addicted to pain medications and that they are then moving on to heroin. So per the Ingham County Health Department, people addicted to pain pills are 40 times more likely to use heroin. And the thing that we know about heroin right now is it's not truly heroin, it's a fentanyl analog. And so people are dying because it's never consistent. I don't think you can trust a person that you're buying off the street. You can't trust your drug dealers to give you the same amount of fentanyl every single time, the same fentanyl analogs, what they're cutting it with, which increases our risk for overdose. Same thing with all of our stimulants, anything that we're using substances on. This is some information just to tell us that there's a lot of people out there who are using illicit drugs that started out maybe with pain prescriptions and marijuana and have gone on further. It may be that they started out with a pain medication went on to heroin. It could be that they're misusing stimulants. It could be any of the substances, but we know that more than 30 million people are using illicit drugs, that over 11 million people misuse opioids, which includes prescription pain relievers and heroin. But there's only 19.7 million people diagnosed with substance use disorder. Many reasons why these numbers do not add, because misuse does not also equivalent to a substance use disorder. For opioid use disorder, we know that there's over 2 million people. Many of those are from prescription pain, but there are some from heroin as well. What is the impact of these medications, or what are the effects? I mean, we talk about drugs all the time. And so what do they really do? I think that's really important for us to understand that if someone says that I use marijuana, and I have a ton of patients who say, Dr. Miller, I use marijuana for my anxiety. And I would say, okay, so what kind of marijuana do you smoke? And they'll look at me kind of funny. I'm like, are you using indica or sativa? And if they're telling me that they're using sativa for anxiety, then I'm like, well, we should have a conversation about this, because that actually is more stimulating than indica. I was having a conversation a couple of weeks ago with a patient about the types of marijuana that they're using. And the patient was literally like, you know what? I choose it based on the flavor. I don't know if it really is a stimulating or one that's more sedating. I like the flavors. So then I'm like, okay, so we're talking more about you enjoy smoking marijuana. Let's just be real about it, which is what I tell my patients all the time. Let's be real. Let's be truthful about everything. So if we know what the impact of the different substances that our patients or our consumers or our clients or our friends or whomever we're around are using, it's better for us. So knowing that people can be intoxicated, which means that they could be relaxed, they could have uninhibited behaviors, they could be very sleepy from it. This would be a sedative or a depressant. That with opioids, we know that there could be drowsiness, shallow breathing, or constipation. Stimulants can raise blood pressure, increase the heart rate, and make them more alert. Some of the short-term effects are appetite changes, sleep changes. You can increase the heart rate, or you can actually decrease the heart rate. Our speech can be impacted. We can have cognitive impairment or even stimulation. We can have euphoria, coordination, which is usually the loss of coordination. We start to see a negative impact when it starts impacting our professional, our personal, and interpersonal relationships. There are also some long-term effects. We can see mental health concerns such as depression, anxiety, panic disorders. We can have increased aggression, paranoia, hallucinations. We also know that long-term effects could impact a person's memory, their learning, and concentration. And then there's a slew of medical problems that can occur. It could impact our heart, our kidneys, liver. Pretty much every one of our organs can be impacted by long-term use of substances. We know that we're at higher risk for HIV, Hep B, and Hep C, depending upon the mode of use. And if we're sharing needles, or even if you are sharing your pipes, if you're snorting, you can burn the insides of your nostrils, have sores when you go to share your tube, then you can also share the blood on there. If you're having a crack pipe, when you're inhaling, you have sores on your lips. And if it's glass, especially, like if you don't have any other abilities, but you use a glass pipe and you burn your lip, you can also give somebody hepatitis through that. There's so many long-term impacts in really having the conversations, which I know I get ahead of myself on, but I get so excited about harm reduction. There's also the impact of separation of healthcare, which means a lot of times when we are using substances or we're even in treatment for substances, we don't get treated for our chronic diseases because they're at different locations. The same providers don't see those patients. And so I actually give a lot of information on separation of healthcare that we don't have time to truly discuss tonight. So let's talk about shame and stigma. This is the area that I could literally talk for days on. I usually ask people to have a discussion about why is Narcan free to a dope addict, but my insulin is $750 a month. Actually, I've had colleagues and friends ask me about this. And if we had a session, where it was open discussion, I would ask you what this means, but tonight I'm going to give you the answers. So this puts one disease state over another. This says that diabetes is more important than a person with opioid use disorder or substance use disorder. It exemplifies a problem with society, that the lack of caring and compassion about our fellow human beings. Many of the memes similar to this imply or state that someone with an addiction is less worthy of receiving life-saving medication, that someone with a chronic disease state that is normal is more valuable than somebody that has an addiction. And then the words in here, dope, addict, those are really negative, stigmatizing words. It's all wrong in my world. It actually stigmatizes people. That is a visible sign, but it's also, when we talk about stigma, it's a mark of disgrace that somebody has a self-conscious emotion, informs them of an internal state of inadequacy, and it leads to a lot of problems. And so we stigmatize others. People feel the shame of it. And when people feel shame, they usually act in one of four ways. And so this is adapted from Nathanson from 1992, but I find it to be how my patients respond. They usually withdraw. They isolate, they run and hide, they do things to not come into the clinic to see us. They may attack themselves. They may self-harm. They may not find themselves worthy enough to even get care. They could avoid, do more substances or alcohol. They might have thrill-seeking behaviors. They may be in denial. And then a lot of times, as a pharmacist, I used to hear a lot about this with my students who work in community pharmacy, that the people will lash out at them. And my front desk staff will say, oh, so-and-so is so upset, they come in, they're screaming at us, they want their meds early, they're attacking others. But it's really interesting. If you really talk with people, this is what comes out. I sat with anger long enough that he told me his real name is shame. And that's really what happens. Unfortunately, there is a purpose to shame and stigma. It regulates, it isolates, it relegates, and it discriminates. It is completely negative to any person who has substance use disorder, who has dependence on medications that people don't feel, or that people stigmatize even use of them. And then unfortunately, we know that the impact is on their health. So those areas I spoke about a few minutes ago about the health. And people then, when they feel that shame, if they're avoiding, it limits their willingness to access care or services. They also then start internalizing a lot of these shame and stigmatizing feelings, and they act out, maybe against themselves, maybe against society. And then people start discriminating against them. People even discriminate against themselves. So what can we do? What can we do to shame no more? What are the practices to decrease the shame and the stigma in the patients with substance misuse, addiction, substance use disorder, and opioid use disorder? I'm just going to go through a few of them because I know over the next couple hours this evening and tomorrow evening that you're going to have a lot of these conversations. One thing I say is to have the open conversations with the people that we serve. Before they even get their prescription for opioids or stimulants or antidepressants, having the conversations with them. If you know that one of the people that you're working with, whether you're in the criminal justice system or as a nurse or social work or business or however, have conversations with people. Ask them about their treatment plans. I even discussed this with optometrists. I have a very similar presentation that I've given to optometrists to really have the discussion about being open. Make sure that we are focusing on prevention, that we have family history, we know their personal history, and that we're addressing adverse childhood experiences. There's a study by Kaiser several years ago where they talked about the more adverse childhood events you have, the more likelihood that you are going to have disease states or negative outcomes. This includes alcohol and alcohol misuse. It also increases risk for other health-related problems. It also increases risk for violence, for unintended pregnancies, suicide attempts, multiple sex partners, for all of the things that we're talking about tonight. It's interesting because I was at a presentation and this person named Jess Tilley said, trauma was my gateway drug. And so really making sure that we are discussing these areas when we are talking with persons about substance use disorder. Really focusing on treatment in these last few minutes that I have to present. Patient-focused care, making sure that we're making sure our patients have access to medications, that it's coordinated care, and there are recovery services. Every time we see our patients, find out where they are in their stages of change. I have a patient who says to me, Dr. Miller, never going to stop. And I said, that is fine. And I'm never going to stop asking, just in case there's one time that you come into an appointment and you decide that you want to make a change in your life. So you continue on, and I'm going to continue to support the decisions that you make while also asking you about your stages of change. Making sure that we are aware of medication for addiction treatment, that we understand that we need to have access for our patients, that they need to not have to hide this, that when they go into a criminal justice system, that they have access to it versus going through withdrawals, that there is knowledge about it. We have open communication. We talk about the duration. Historically, medication for addiction treatment was a 1 year with buprenorphine, and we weren't certain about methadone. Now we know buprenorphine may be for the patient's lifetime, and we know we can do this longer. We also need to have the conversations about relapse. It is part of the process. Why did someone relapse? Having the conversation of how then to work through whatever happened. We also need to know that we need to have access to care. 1 in 3 people do not have access to health coverage and are unable to afford it. And honestly, people are not receiving their substance use disorder treatment. Something that we can do right away is tonight you can make a change in how you have your language. Do not be negative. Make sure all of your language is in a positive tone. A couple of weeks, or I guess it was probably a month ago, one of my patients came in and said, Doc, I dropped dirty today. And I said, did you need a shower? It's like, no, I was dirty. I said, did you not have access to a bathroom? He said, no, my urine was dirty. I said, oh, you have a urinary tract infection. He said, no, I have drugs in my urine. I said, oh, you're positive for substances in your urine. Okay, so let's talk about that. I knew exactly what he was saying, but I went through that for him to understand that he's not defined by that. I'm not dirty. So if we use the words that are more positive, we can help the person realize that they actually have value. We can change policies. We can allow for medication for addiction treatment in jails and prisons so that persons aren't going through withdrawals. And then as soon as they leave their criminal justice system, that they're not having an overdose due to a decrease in tolerance. We can do public awareness for chronic diseases. So how do you become more involved? The CDC has a 5-point strategy. We know we need better services. We need better data. So if you're a data person and you can develop computer systems, that is great. We have better pain management, better targeting of overdose reversing drugs, better research. There are so many things that each and every one of us can make a difference in. And there are a ton of resources. So you don't have to be a prescriber to know these resources. Prescribe to Prevent is for patients, pharmacists, prescribers. It can be for anybody. Go and get the information. So that's in the top right corner. Michigan Recovery is the one on the bottom right corner. It tells you where services are. You put in a little bit of information. You can put in the location and it will tell you what the insurances are that are needed for each of those facilities. SAMHSA.gov has a toolkit for providers. You can go in there, whether or not your provider, ask questions then. In the state of Michigan, we have a ton of harm reduction agencies. We have the Michigan Harm Reduction in Traverse City, Grand Rapids Red Project, which is actually across the west side of the state. There are places all over that can carry naloxone. One thing, if you are working in a healthcare facility, not to stigmatize people when they're coming back, no rolling your eyes, no huffing when they come back for a refill. That means they're using it and somebody's still alive. Remember to have the conversations about the monsters in the medicine cabinet. Talk about needle disposal. Make sure that everybody is aware of them. Go to michigan.deq to find out where you can dispose of needles or the persons that you're working with are disposing of needles. Honestly, in the last couple of minutes, what I want to tell you is know your resources, have honest conversations, decrease the shame and stigma. A patient said, Someone treated me as a human, and I hadn't even realized that hadn't happened in a long time. This person actually had gone in with an abscess. They didn't give this person pain meds. They didn't value them as a human because they were a substance user. We would never think of that for somebody who has diabetes, who eats sugar and needs an amputated foot. We would always make sure they have anesthesia. But somebody who has substance use disorder or opioid use disorder, they don't always treat them that way. My motto in life is be the change you wish to see in the world by Gandhi. I challenge you to take the information that we briefly spoke about today and think. You don't have to believe as I do, but to think about how we treat people and the things that we do and how to make it better for persons who are using substances who have a disorder that is also a disease state. All right, I think I only went over by a minute. I do have a list of references. Oh, Gail, I think you're muted.
There we go. Hi, wonderful. Thank you, Dr. DeVries Miller. Thank you so much. What interesting information. So at this time, Dr. DeVries Miller is going to be joined by a panel of experts, and that will be followed by a Q&A period for the audience. So the first panel member is Shelby Posh from Central Michigan District Health Department. Shelby is a health promotion supervisor with the department and oversees their syringe service program, their sexual health clinic, and hepatitis C linkage to care program. Her background is in substance use prevention and health education at the local community level. She is a wife, a mom of 2 boys, and she wants anyone in the audience who is also a CMU alumni to know that she roots Fire Up Chips. Stephen Johnson from 1016 Recovery Network is a person in recovery employed by 1016 as a recovery coach in the Big Rapids outpatient location, as a wellness advocate at both Big Rapids and Reed City Spectrum Health emergency departments. His role as a recovery coach is to guide those seeking outpatient counseling towards sustained recovery with individual coaching sessions and peer support groups by sharing recovery tools he's gained from training as well as lived experience. Having lived in both addiction and recovery offers a different kind of approach to guide treatment because he can directly relate to where the person is or has been, as well as inspire hope that it can and will get better if they choose to invest in themselves and their recovery. It's this same approach that makes himself and his fellow advocates beneficial in the emergency department setting because they offer that same relatability and support to persons struggling with substance use disorders who are hospitalized and offer resources for all types of recovery pathways. He has just under 6 years of continued sobriety, working an active 12-step program, and has a podcast he started in May 2020 about addiction recovery and behavioral health. His life has changed drastically for the better, and he's always very motivated to share his story in hopes that it may help someone get even one step closer to a better life. Also joining us is Jeffrey Stoll. He has served with the Grand Valley State University Police Department since August of 2006. Since then, he has worked in a variety of positions at GVSU Police Department and also worked part-time as a road patrol deputy for the Ottawa County Sheriff's Department. In the fall of 2007, Captain Stoll was hired as a full-time officer for GVSU Police, where he worked on night shift road patrol. In the fall of 2012, Captain Stoll was promoted to sergeant as a road patrol supervisor and was responsible for all special events on campus. In the spring of 2018, Captain Stoll was promoted to assistant director and captain of all Allendale campus operations, including all patrol officers, as well as the detective and community policing units. And also joining us is Taylor Gibson. Taylor Gibson serves as the Ferris State University Crew Site Coordinator. She works directly with students who are exploring, seeking, and deeply involved in their recovery. The goal of the program is to provide a safe and supportive environment where they're able to meet students where they are at in terms of their recovery process and to provide them with the necessary resources to succeed in college and beyond. Through programming, Taylor offers peer support sessions, one-on-one check-ins, and AOD wellness sessions. FSU Crew also hosts sober social events, prevention tabling events at campus, and offers a classroom education to interested professors. Welcome to all of the panel members. So we will now open the floor to the audience for questions. If you would please use the chat box to list your questions, we will monitor that chat box and ask the questions for you. So at this time, please access the chat box. It's open for you to ask your questions. Thank you.
So welcome panel. My name's Bree and I am the administrative assistant for CMREN. So just while everyone's thinking about their questions, I did have a question that I would like to ask you guys just to get the conversation going. So what is the difference between substance use disorder, opioid use disorder, and addiction? And I know Dr. Miller spoke about this briefly, but if you guys could give some insight, that would be amazing.
Well, I'm jumping. I'm Steven, 1016. So really, when it comes down to it, it's just kind of like subcategorizing all the substances uses. I mean, someone has a substance use disorder when they present with things like tolerance, if it's affecting their quality of life, how often they use it, what type of frequency they use it. Opioid use disorder would just be that category of substance in the opiate family. And kind of addiction is just like the broad answer to all of it. Addiction could fall into behavioral addiction. It could fall into, non-narcotic substance addiction. But basically, it's all just kind of like subcategorizing all the same thing, just in the different areas.
Thanks, Stephen. And that just brings to another point on the harm reduction side, that when it comes to overdose prevention and the use of Narcan or naloxone, that does only work against opioids. So if someone has a different substance in their system, it's not going to reverse that overdose because, again, it's just for opioids, and that's how it chemically works in the brain as well.
One of the things that I typically talk about is tolerance, dependence, and addiction. And tolerance is when we're using a certain amount of a substance and we need more of it to get that same effect. I give an example of coffee, where most people start out with only needing 1 cup of coffee, but may need a stronger coffee or more coffee to get them woke up in the morning. Dependence is where if you stop having that substance, you're going to go through some withdrawal feelings of it. And again, using that with coffee is that if you stop using it, you might be drowsy the next day. And then addiction is where we have behavioral changes. There's a lot of things that impacts our quality of life. There's a lot of things that go on to say, so this is a very broad, non-scientific example is when I usually do my example of the tolerance, dependence, and addiction is then to say, how many of you would hold up a Starbucks or a Big B because you couldn't have your coffee? If you did, then that's interfering with the risk versus the benefits with that and really making a difference in where you're used. So you stepped up the reason why you're using it's a need, and you can't put the risk or the benefits over the risks. And so that's one of the ways that I explain that. And I agree exactly with Stephen about just different branching of how we diagnose.
We do have some questions coming into the chat. The first one being, what would you say would be one of the biggest takeaway points? So this question might be a question that you guys would answer later on as discussion goes forward. But if you guys had a response now, that would be okay.
I'm not sure what the question is really asking, like takeaway points from what exactly? Like Stephen and I are both in recovery, so from like being in recovery, or I'm just not sure.
Well, as he clarifies that for us, another question was there are many options for recovery. So how does one determine where to start?
I think each one of us are going to have a very different answer on this. I'm in the city of Grand Rapids, and so we have a gatekeeper for actual services. But honestly, it's having those open and honest conversations about what is needed. We know that if somebody their substance of choice is alcohol, that we need to have them hospitalized because that can actually be deadly. But we know that there are different needs for different people, and really assessing where they are before we can make that decision. Kent County, specifically Grand Rapids, we send them to Network 180, which is the gatekeeper. But some people have private insurance and they have to call their insurance company, and you have to go through those steps. I think Taylor and Stephen probably have very different answers though.
Yeah, it really depends on where the person's at. I mean, what recovery is such a broad spectrum to so many different people. I mean, I see people day in and day out, and some of them just want to get to the place where, hey, I don't want to be hospitalized, by the substance I'm using. So that kind of has to be enough for right now. Maybe they still want to use marijuana or drink, or maybe they don't want to take an abstinence-based approach, but they want to stop using a substance that's landing them in the hospital or overdosing. So to them, that is recovery. I mean, they're getting off of a harmful behavior and they're making life improvements. Now, someone who's abstinence-based may look at that person and say, well, that's not recovery. You're still getting high every day, or you're still going to the bar on the weekends, or you're not working a program and making behavioral changes and coping skills and all that. But because they have two different definitions of recovery to begin with. So it's really hard to put it as a definite answer, like it's a starting point or an end point. So it's kind of like that. And it all really depends on what the person wants.
And also to your point too, that to accept that relapse is also a part of recovery. So when it comes to treatment, when it comes to someone's journey, it's not a one size fits all. So where you start is not necessarily where you end. And that it's not it's not a black and white scenario, that there's different steps that can be taken and everybody's journey is different. So when it comes to navigating that, I know through our syringe service program, we just have the treatment options available. So if someone is ready to take that next step, we have multiple different avenues for them to kind of look at and see what's going to fit their need at that time. And we do whatever we can to support them in that decision, just knowing that what they decide in that moment might not be what they decide tomorrow. Just kind of keeping that conversation open and knowing that we are here to support that when they're ready.
I just want to touch on what Stephen said as well. So a lot of people that find themselves in recovery are 12-steppers and involved in AA. And that was, very different from my experience with recovery. And so it can look like a lot different for all of us. And because of that, it starts in a lot of different places. And like myself, it started after I went to jail and was mandated to start attending a peer group at 1016, actually. And because of that, I didn't end up in a 12-step program, and I don't attend meetings. And I think people need to understand, like Stephen said, that recovery looks very different for all of us. And that's why there's so many different approaches, whether it's like through Dharma recovery or a traditional 12-step or what they call like natural recovery. It's about, meeting the person where they're at and providing them with what they need.
So our next question is, in your opinion, what is the best way to encourage someone suffering from SUD addiction and to recognize that they have a problem?
I think that's like a super loaded question because you can't push anyone to that point. We talk a lot about like seed planting and how important that is, especially when students meet with me. Most students are mandated to meet with me, and so they're at most of the time in no point ready to acknowledge that there's any issues with their substance use at all. And so it's not my job to sit there and, drive it down their throats that there is something wrong and we need to address this. It's just about planting seeds and giving them the opportunity to come to that conclusion on their own. When you try to force recovery on someone, the outcome is, probably never going to be what you'd like it to be.
I agree with Taylor. People really need to come to their own determinations. It usually comes after a point of desperation. things in their life just are flashing evidence in their faces that they have a problem, and then they, you know, go through the processes of, well, let me try to moderate, let me try to fix this, let me try to do it every which way but the way you're suggesting to me, because they need to prove to themselves that it's not working the way that they're trying to make it work. But there is this method called motivational interviewing, and it's not a way to trick people into their answer. It's a way to ask them specifically guided questions to pull out of them their answer. So if someone is on a scale of 1 to 10 and they're like, well, I don't want to quit. Okay, well, where are you at on a scale of 1 to 10? Well, I'm at a 3. Oh, well, why are you at a 3 and not like a 2? Well, because I got these problems, da 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 da. And then it becomes this conversation. Okay, let's just focus on this 3. Now, what would it take to happen in your life to make you get to a 4? Because if I'm like, what makes you want to quit today? That's a lot. You know, that's an extreme. But if I say, what would it take to get to a 4? You know, oh, well, I'd probably have to like lose my girlfriend or my job or something. So these type of conversations are them answering their own questions, and you're just guiding the question. You know what I mean?
All right. So we have a couple more questions. How has your work addressed substance use or opioid use disorder with different professions?
I can start on this one. So I first got into the substance use field through prevention. And so that's a lot different than where I am now with harm reduction. So prevention, I was in schools working with kiddos, just kind of like what Taylor said, planting those seeds, starting those conversations, really getting to just like the core of decision making. And then now with harm reduction, I am able to accept substance use disorder, and how can we make this safe? How can we make, like, the decisions made, this is what's going on. How can we make it as safe as possible for you to live your life the way that you choose to live it? And I can honestly say that I definitely have found my niche more with harm reduction, because I get to accept the person for who they are, and I can help them feel like that human being, because a lot of times they have to hide this and they don't feel comfortable talking about it. Whereas when they come to our syringe service program, they're able to ask those questions and give us feedback on, you know, what size syringes they need, when they're going to bring their sharps in. I can give them Narcan. They can do secondary exchange, and they can take, you know, what they need for themselves, but also for everybody else. So that approach is a lot different, and sometimes it's different for people to kind of wrap their head around it, but I love advocating for it, because again, it kind of reduces that stigma, and like, this is life and this is how we're going to live it, and let's make it as safe as possible for everybody.
So my employer is Ferris. I'm employed fully by Ferris State University. And it's been really interesting because I'm a pharmacist who was a social worker before, and we are focused on prescription medications. And I got really involved in harm reduction a few years ago after attending a presentation and then saying, I need to talk to my colleagues about this. I need to talk to my peers about harm reduction and getting involved. But as a social worker, I was in the treatment part of it. I've worked in psychiatric hospitals. I've worked with persons who have substance use disorder, and they're all different parts of their lives. So it's been a return for me. And I can tell you that, like Shelby, I love to meet people where they are. So while I don't know what it feels like to be using, or to know that my friend died from a heroin overdose that was really not heroin, I get to be a part of things that are right where the people are, where they are emotionally, where they are physically, and get to be a part of that. And then I am fortunate enough that I get to be a part of education processes with my peers and with students, and really hoping to engage more people in understanding the stigma and the shame and the harm reduction. So my employer's been pretty awesome. And I get to work with every profession, which is awesome, meaning business. I get to work with pharmacy, because I'm a pharmacist, optometry, nursing, social work, criminal justice. It's really exciting.
Well, thank you. We have a question for Captain Stoll. Oh, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I saw a couple on there for me. I appreciate it. And I wanted to touch on the other one too about ongoing with the rates, addiction and STD rates during the pandemic. It's been very interesting for us in law enforcement. With my demographic here in campus law enforcement, you know, a lot of people went home to be with their parents. So in some ways we saw substance abuse decrease because they were much more likely to use it, you know, away from home in their residence, their off-campus and on-campus residence. And so it actually went down in some areas. I also know in some ways it went up because there was less to do. So it was kind of a mix that we saw on that. As it relates to law enforcement, you know, we're usually in kind of the SUD and OUD plus components because substance abuse and then an activity that prompts a law enforcement response, unfortunately. So, you know, we're getting in when the abuse causes bad decisions. And we see that frequently with any number of substances where people use the substance so much that it impacts their ability to make sound judgment at times. And then that's where we get involved. But I think, you know, for Grand Valley, we've got a pretty good support system to try and help divert the younger demographic from moving towards a more entrenched abuse disorder situation. And so hopefully our early on contacts help identify kind of a root cause and prompt some discussions to maybe change the behavior. And I think, you know, one of the last questions there on for me was about opioid use specific to college student demographic. That's pretty low. We see that very rarely. I think one of the reasons we don't see it is because so prominently it's associated with pain meds and chronic pain, and this demographic just hasn't experienced that yet as much, and so they're not exposed to that type of chemical. And they're also a little bit more interested in trying some of the more, I think, synthetic or creative types of chemicals that can cause, and that they share, as was shared earlier, their own sets of danger.
I just wanted to touch on this as well. This is a discussion that we've been having. The other two, my counterparts who hold these positions at CMU and Mid-Michigan Community College. And despite the fact that it's not seen in a lot of the research that Ferris does in their biannual report about substances used by students, and, you know, this is self-reported data on campus, you know, alcohol and marijuana are up there. But one that we've all experienced throughout our time in college, which was a little while ago, but I also still have a brother in college who's 20, and stimulants and study drugs, we have all come to the agreement, or we believe are heavily used on campuses and not reported during these studies as much, because students, we think, don't tend to see them as abuse or misuse of substances, but rather that these are medications that I'm using to finish a paper or study, and someone got them prescribed them by a doctor anyway. So there's, you know, not this same stigma associated with that type of substance use as, you know, inappropriate or substance misuse by college students.
That's a great point, Taylor. I think, you know, when we've monitored social media and been involved in interactions, those study drugs have such a huge spike around midterms and final exams, where all of a sudden you hear a lot more chatter about it, and you'll see some more reports and have some more interactions. And even though many of the people on this conference recognize that the research is overwhelmingly showing that those don't really help that much with academics. But despite that research, there's just a feeling that staying up with that and using that illicitly will help them on exams.
Thank you for that. That's a thought I never thought about with drugs for studies. So, as we all know, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and one of the questions in the chat is, there's still incoming data on opioids and SUD rates, and we wanted to know, what is your opinion and expectation of the ongoing global COVID-19 pandemic, and how the addiction and SUD rates on the general population and the at-risk population? So how will the pandemic affect the addiction and SUD rates on our populations?
I know for myself, I just took one look at Facebook right when this whole thing started, and, you know, just people on there, like family members, people who never struck me once as having any type of SUD problem or day drinking. And, You know, they got time to kill, some have money to spend. People can only kind of be with themselves for a minute before they turn to what's kind of commonly known as a quick checkout, you know, and it may start off as, well, I have nothing to do. It's like a mini vacation, but, you know, just out of nowhere, it can turn into a routine, you know, and a dependency. And I was actually just talking to someone this morning, and, you know, a lot of people really state they're just like, I started using more, drinking more during the pandemic. I was laid off. I was bored. I had this unemployment money coming in, and I had nothing to do with myself. So one thing turns to another, and here we go. Now, you know, once the world starts to resume, now they got something kind of holding them back a little bit. So there's a lot of that, a lot of boredom, a lot of stress with all the stuff that happened last year. I don't see specific patterns. I just see a overall pattern of use and kind of stress levels, and people just turning to that who, you know, never really had an issue like that before, are kind of just turning to that because that's a quick, easy Band-Aid, you know.
And we're seeing that people are using alone, whatever their substances are, that if there is a reversal agent or somebody passes out or whatever it is, if they're using alone, they can't get the help that they need. So we've had an increase of those overdoses. We have, as Stephen said, a lot more people using. Anxiety is high. Access is, you get it, but you don't know what you're getting. We know that there's a lot of ways that we're getting substances coming from the South, from overseas, and you can't trust your drug dealers. That's the big thing, is so if you are using illicit substances, you don't know what you're getting. Just even progress. So a couple of years ago, we knew that west of the Mississippi, that methamphetamine was a huge problem. Now we're seeing methamphetamine use here quite a bit. Is it because that was the progression, or because it was more with COVID? But it's just more. And overdoses, unfortunately, that are resulting in death.
And to piggyback off of that as well, we are seeing an increase in how many doses of Narcan it is taking to reverse an overdose. So that just can show that the drugs are a little bit more potent. There may be more fentanyl than one thinks. So just keeping that in mind as well. We do offer fentanyl test strips through our syringe service program so that people can test their substance before they use it for fentanyl to see if it's present, so that they know if it may be stronger than what they're used to. And also to dive into, not only am I terrified to know what maybe our rates are going to look like for the year 2020 for SUD and OUD, but also the increase in possible HIV and hepatitis C infections that come with increased use, the sharing of needles and things like that. My other hat that I wear is I oversee our sexual health clinic here at the health department, and our STD rates are through the roof. We are seeing more gonorrhea, more chlamydia, more syphilis than we have seen in years past. And so social distancing isn't quite working during a pandemic.
So to piggyback off of that last question, what are some of the challenges you're finding in this work of SUD, OUD, especially during a pandemic? And then what are some rewards you're seeing being in this remote space?
I can hop in real quick. I can say our biggest challenge is meeting people that we need to be getting to. We're very rural, and we know that we're not getting supplies into the hands of people who need it. We're trying to get creative, and I think we're doing better, especially by distributing overdose kits. But we know with the rates that we're seeing within the opioid epidemic, we're not getting to everybody that we need, which means we're not getting to everyone who needs HIV and hepatitis C testing. We're not giving them that avenue for people who need an outlet into treatment. So that I think is very frustrating, and it is a barrier. But I can also attest to the amount of secondary exchange we're seeing through our program, and how wonderful that is when someone takes the initiative to come in and see us and get supplies for everybody else, or they can share with us that, hey, your needles are too short. We need these ones. Okay, great. I don't know that. So now I know what to order. We know that our nasal naloxone isn't as good as intermuscular from what we hear from people. So, okay, that's good. Now I know what to order. So just hearing those things from people and just finding those little champions within our community to, you know, take that step to walk through our doors and to tell us what we're doing and tell us what they need.
I'm glad you asked that question. I'm glad you also asked to take note of some of the positive things, because, you know, that's something I tried to focus on last year. Like, there was a lot of barriers, having to shut down, reopen, shut down again, outpatient. You know, we had to close off our groups. We had to limit our group sizes, kind of only, we had to kind of put it in people's hands. Like, do you want to come or not? You know, because I don't want to drag a couple people, you know, into groups, because sometimes they need that. Sometimes they just need to overcome that barrier of shyness, or, you know, trying to have it the easiest way they can get it. Anyway, my point is that, you know, we had to go through so many changes. It affected people's routines. It kind of got them comfy with not coming in or just picking up the phone and calling once a week. So that threw off a lot of connection we had and momentum that they had going. But at the same time, you know, and then meetings, like a lot of AA, NA meetings all shut down. But at the same time, Zoom became like a really good tool. And, you know, our meeting, you know, the meeting I attend probably had 4 or 5 people in it normally. And after we shut down in person, Zoom kind of came out of nowhere. Now we have like 20 people, and they're from Midland. There's people coming from Utah. There's people coming from North Carolina. You know, all these people who can meet together 3 times a week and talk recovery have all built these connections and strengths over the last year. And that's a positive. That's something that kind of came out of nowhere. And I don't know, it's like, I'm just grateful that I met these people, and they're grateful they got in touch with us, and it really built our community. So there's 2 sides to it.
I heard Shelby talking about the harm reduction concerns because the rural, and even in the city, we have people who don't know that Red Project is still open or that harm reduction services are available still. Last week, I literally gave the telephone number to one of my patients and said, no, it's open, call. You call when you get there, they get your supplies ready, get a full month of supplies just in case you can't get back, because he doesn't have transportation all the time. And so still that communication has been difficult, but I can say that more people are talking. That's what I don't know if it's because of COVID or we're just at a transition time, but I feel like more people are talking about services. More people are talking about naloxone and harm reduction and services. I'm really excited, and maybe it's because I'm more in tune to it. I just find that we're more open to conversations.
All right. Well, thank you. So, Susan, you kind of are pivoting us to our next question, because someone asked, how do we reduce stigma related to substance use disorders at a community-wide level? So how do we change people's perceptions?
I want to know this answer too. I mean, I think attending things like this, having the conversations, I will literally have a conversation with anybody about most any topic. And I think we have to continuously do that, and we have to say no. So I'm very much a person who fights for other people. I am a person of privilege. I have a job, I have a husband, I have, you know, the 2 children and a dog and a cat, and, you know, it looks like it's this perfect world, but I'm still out there fighting every single day. I fight for diversity, equity, inclusion, which includes persons who use substances. It includes persons who are in recovery. We have to have the conversations that are difficult. It's really becoming comfortable with that uncomfortable, as I spoke about earlier. But I really want to know how we fix this, because I want the magic wand to fix it today.
I agree, Susan. And also being uncomfortable, admitting that you don't know, admitting that you aren't on that same page as a person who is not in recovery. I have to be okay letting my guard down and say, hey, can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean? Or can you explain that a little bit more? Because I don't know. And how am I going to best serve you if I don't know what I'm doing? And I'm not going to pretend that I do.
Something that's really important as well is that people in recovery openly talk and share about their experience. I think a lot of people don't realize how many people in their lives are in recovery because it's just not spoken about. We don't want to admit that we've had struggles in our life. There's a lot of shame associated with that. A lot of places, especially anywhere I've worked as a social worker before, I couldn't walk into my workplace and talk about the joys of my recovery and what it was like to have a substance misuse disorder without feeling an immense amount of shame and concern for what my coworkers and peers would think about me. And I think that's just something that we need to overcome and understand that talking about this is the only way that we can educate each other and break down those walls of stigma through shared experience and understanding.
Well, thank you. And kind of to tie in with that last question, how do we build trust with individuals who are experiencing this substance use disorder, that may be timid or have mistrust towards engaging in harm reduction services, because of that stigma, people do not want to receive services. So how do we help them build that trust so they're going to get help?
This is our biggest barrier because at the local health department level, we are attached to the state police post. So how many people do you think want to come to us to get syringes? So I really want to open the floor up, and I would love to hear from other people. But just from our experience a little bit, it has definitely taken those champions in the community to step through our doors, to take that risk, to see that we are 3 young girls behind here that are super sweet and we're not judgmental. We will give you everything you need and then some. But it's going to take that one person to walk through our doors. We are trying to get creative, and especially during a pandemic when things are shut down and we have to social distance, and avenues that we were used to utilizing aren't available to us anymore. So we are getting creative with that. But I would love to hear from everybody else on this because I will take all the advice I can get.
So one of the things that I'm very involved with the Grand Rapids Red Project, and there's a users union. And so they're very involved. And we specifically on our board make sure that we have diverse group of persons, including persons who are consumers of services, and having those open conversations. I literally will sit for the 2 hours of our meeting sometimes and just soak in all the information because they're in the thick of it. They're having conversations. I let people tell me about things. And quite honestly, I just sit and listen. One of the things that I tend to do with my patients is remember that I have 1 mouth and 2 ears. So no double talking, and it's more double listening.
I like that. You have 1 mouth and 2 ears. I'm going to start implementing that in my line of work. So another question is, what advice do you have for families living with someone with SUD, OUD? Are there options for children and other family members impacted?
So really when it comes to stuff like this, they do have programs like Al-Anon for the family members or spouses, partners of the person with SUD. They have Alateen and things like that for children. I think they're less accessible, but then again, also in the era of Zoom, there's a lot of things online. It comes with learning how to kind of navigate in a troubled system. You know what I mean? Because it depends. Is this SUD the parent, the one who has the power, the control? Are they bigger? Are they, you know what I mean? And it's harder for kids. But yeah, just for partners, family members, things like Al-Anon can work wonders because it really, people will lose themselves trying to manage the addict or the person with SUD, and it can become almost like a codependency thing where they're putting too much focus and trying to use too much energy trying to control something they really ultimately have no control over. So more so for the adult people affected by someone's SUD, I always try to suggest things like Al-Anon. That way it's like, hey, you know, I understand where you're coming from. It could be all the best intentions in the world, but you've got to take care of you. And you kind of have to allow them, there's ways to guide them, you know, kind of like that motivational interviewing stuff. But it's hard when it's someone really close to you. So you almost need to protect yourself and make sure you don't get lost in it and allow them to feel the effects of what they're doing, not in a shameful way, not in like a guilt trip, just a reality. Like, if this is what you choose to do, like I need to do what I need to do for me. I think that's the best thing someone in a family like that can do for themselves.
There are a lot of different support groups out there, as Stephen talked about. There is allegedly, I'm saying allegedly, more treatment opportunities and support for families. There's supposed to be counseling available. Insurances are supposed to be paying for more things like that. In my utopia, they would, but that doesn't mean that that's actually accessible. If people feel comfortable utilizing Zoom for some of those meetings, I know some insurances are now saying if you utilize Zoom, there's no copays or things of that nature. There are different organizations. So there's Families Against Narcotics for persons who have died or had persons using opioids. They are very abstinence-based program. There are, and that's something that we talked about earlier, is that depends on the person. Are they in treatment and they're using a substance such as medication for addiction treatment? Are they not using one substance because that was the substance that was causing the most destruction in their world, but they're using other substances? And so unfortunately with treatments, they can also be judgmental to the family. And helping the families find the resources is really important. That my recovery that I showed during my presentation has some of those resources available as well. Individual counseling, family counseling, and sometimes it's not family counseling with a person that actually has the use disorder, because you, as Stephen said, you need to be separate. You need to back away and have your own sources of support too. I think this is a really hard area for people to access, because we tend to focus on the person who is in need. And that might be the person who has the addiction or use disorder, and the family doesn't get the treatment right away or doesn't focus on themselves, because the person who's in most need is the one who is overdosed or has lost their job or whatever. But we need to really encourage the families to get their support to survive that. I don't share a lot of my story. I have a husband who had a prescription opioid overdose. Many people know that. And it was because I gave him the prescriptions after surgery, and he doesn't have an addiction issue, but I do have a child who overdosed. And I instantly got them in, back to their therapist. And then I sought therapy and still see the therapist, and it's been years. But it's making sure that all the people around the environment can be healthy.
Thank you for that, and thank you for sharing, Susan. Captain Stoll, we have a question for you. Can you speak about drug courts and other options available for those in jails/prisons?
Of course. So for us here at Grand Valley, Ottawa County does have one very distinct sobriety court that's based out of Holland. So a number of our interactions don't necessarily fall into sobriety court. I think sobriety court is much more deliberate for repeat offenders or those that are struggling with substance abuse disorder. But coming out of that, I know the Judge Susan Jonas has done a tremendous job, and they've seen a lot of success in that focus program. And I think a lot of it just has to do with attention. Oftentimes in the criminal justice system, there's not a lot of attention paid to those people who have been cited and or arrested. And I think that, you know, that doesn't, we've talked a lot about support and connections over the course of this evening, and certainly our our system doesn't necessarily set up for that. And I think that's one of the challenges. And those very distinct and very deliberate systems, as you mentioned, with drug courts, sobriety courts, mental health courts, things like that, those programs with dedicated resources have shown a good return on investment by being able to reduce recidivism and relapse and going back and maintaining the lifestyle with substance abuse disorder. So I think, you know, those programs have proven to be very beneficial.
I would love to touch on that as well. Here in Michigan, we utilize HIDA and 7411. These are two programs that are specified for what are more considered like young adult offenders. I believe the programs, you can qualify them from maybe 21 or 23 is the cutoff. But these are programs, one is for felony charges and one is for misdemeanor charges. And so this applies a lot to the demographic that I work with. And they are just options to have your any non-violent drug offense deferred and go through treatment court, and then, you know, on the successful completion of treatment court have, you know, never have that charge shown on your record. So but I feel like a lot of people don't know about these programs, and so I've been really trying to share that with my students as much as I can. I've been lucky to not, you know, many students have related legal trouble, but it's really important information that I don't feel is heavily shared in our community, and this is a Michigan-wide programs.
That's twice now, Taylor, you've offered some really good insight that I wish I would have thought of first, both but that 7411 and the HIDA stuff, that is a tremendous, we've utilized that a lot. We're able to, I actually think we do kind of bring that up to our young defendants here from a university level as options when we recognize, you know, what's the best outcome here? How can we set them up for success even with this bad decision? And those programs have proven to be successful because there is still some accountability, but if you maintain that and are accountable, you come out on the other end with no record and are able to kind of move on from that, again, that bad decision.
Thank you for that. I'm learning so much this evening. So you have a question about safe drug disposal. Can you share what safe drug disposal means from your lens and why that topic is important?
So we partnered with, we do partner with 1016 to do medication take back events. They're held a couple times a year. And so what it means is people can bring in their medications that they're no longer taking or that they are expired, and they can dispose of them properly, meaning that we have a police officer who is on site and they can transport them legally to dispose of them. But there's also sites throughout your communities that have them. And Captain Stoll might be able to identify those. But I know for us, it's like most of our police departments have them. They're like mailbox style. So like similar to like when you go to a post office, you open them like the big mailbox and then you just drop in your medications. And then the police officers take them from there to get disposed of properly. Another thing with this is they don't take syringes. So we can accept syringes through our health department, through our syringe service program. That way people can dispose of their syringes properly. And then we can, if like they're a diabetic or they have a certain medication, we can give them a sharps container to take with them so that they don't have to use a makeshift one. That way that they're getting disposed of properly as well. But it's very important to keep medications out of the hands of our youth, and maybe just if someone were to misuse them. I know personally, my grandma, who has a really bad back, takes opioids as a prescription, and I do have a cousin who was stealing them, and so she had to lock them up properly, and then when they were if they were expired, she was able to dispose of them properly just to help protect anybody else that's coming into the home, especially if they know that they have those. It's just to best protect them and everybody. And it's important to just dispose of them properly so that they're not getting into our environment, things like that.
Shelby's right. A lot of police departments, us included, do have those prescription drop boxes. We have 2 locations for the Grand Valley Police Department, one in the Allendale campus and one in the Grand Rapids campus. And it is continually surprising for me how quickly those get filled. They're pretty big mailboxes, and all of a sudden it'll be like a couple months and the whole thing will be packed with pills. And so it goes to show you how many pills are really out there in circulation, which is interesting when you see it from a quantity perspective. But it also highlights the value of it, that all those pills are now taken off. They're not going to be impacting the environment with harm. They're not going to impact the criminal component. And I think, as Shelby brought up, just accidental, situations where a pill is dropped, or a young child gets it. I think those are very beneficial. For us, there's literally nothing else you have to do. You just walk into our lobby and drop off your bag of unused medication, and then you move on. So it is a very conducive situation to find a place to get rid of those. And there are highlighted drug take back days that the DEA sponsors over the course of the year. But I think you'll find a lot of places, even some pharmacies too, there's more and more just, hey, here's a secure place to take your unused medication and get it out of circulation.
A lot of pharmacies can take back non-controls, and there are some that can also take back controls. And so you can always call your pharmacy and ask them, but almost every single police station is an opportunity. But as Shelby said, that's not necessarily what all the people want to return their meds if they have any history of interaction with the police. So there's some stigma that goes along with that. But really calling your pharmacies in April and October, there's two big ones that you can always do too, but contact your pharmacist.
We also have medication disposal bags that we got through 1016's prevention coalitions. And so people can come to the health department and they can get those from us, or we can meet them wherever they are. And you can pour in your medications. So take them out of the container that they come in, and then they dissolve, and it's safe to dispose of right in your trash at home. And one thing that I like about kind of promoting those, especially during the pandemic when we couldn't have in-person big medication take-back events, is that you could be coming to the health department for anything. You could be coming for an immunization, your COVID shot, family planning, so like filling your birth control, anything like that. So it's pretty discreet why you're coming there, and you just get the bag and then take it home with you, and you can dispose of your medications in private as well.
Thank you for that. So there's a question for Stephen. Can you speak a little on your role in the ED?
Yeah, so I worked there in the ED for a program called Project Assert. It's through our agency 1016. And basically what it is it's, putting people in recovery into the emergency room to have conversations with people who present with some form of SUD. So, it can range from anyone who's in there for an overdose, alcohol use. Sometimes it's someone in there for a completely unrelated issue, and when they're getting screened, they either let slip or, somehow go out of their way to mention that, yeah, I do drink regularly or whatever. So what the nurses do, now they're so familiar with us now, is they'll just say, well, we have someone here if you'd like to talk to them, and it's completely voluntary. We just go in there. We have like a evidence-based questionnaire that we do with them, a little bit of a guide, and basically what we do is just kind of see where they're at. We talk to them about what's going on with them. Since we're in recovery, we directly relate, that way any resistance, any type of roadblock that someone would get into when they're trying to, like we talked about this morning, if you were there, have a logical conversation with someone like, hey, your liver's malfunctioning. This is the third time you've been in here. You should stop. We're able to say, I get it, man. Like, I 100% understand. Inspire a little bit of hope, maybe share a story or two about our personal recovery journey that was like, and some things that we did to achieve and sustain recovery. And it's just a different type of conversation. So we have these conversations with people, we offer them resources, we see where they're at. 9 times out of 10, they're more than willing to talk to us and follow up with us, even if they choose not to participate in recovery right now. Could be a harm reduction conversation, could be a, hey, let's just not see you back in here conversation. So we follow up with them for up to 60 days. We only really reach out to them after 1 week, 4 weeks, and 8 weeks, so we're not bugging them. But they are more than willing to reach out to us anytime. We help them get into detox if necessary, advocate for them. I've gotten quite a few people into outpatient, seeing me here at 1016, and just trying to get them involved in any way, because we understand the process. They're obviously in the emergency room. They're not at a great point in their addiction. So they're usually willing to at least have a conversation. And sometimes it's not that first time where they kind of take a look at that and get involved. Sometimes it's the second time. I saw a guy, must have been 4 or 5 times in 1 month, and it was just over and over and over. And that 5th time, he went to rehab. So it's the seed planting, it's the conversations, not giving up on somebody, and just continuing to be there for them. That I feel like makes a huge difference, because otherwise they're going into the hospital, the nurses, the doctors, they'll tell you what you need to do medically, because they're like, hey, you need to stop. And that's kind of where the conversation stops. And that's nothing against them. It's just, that's not what they're there for. We're here to make sure you're medically clear, and we'll give you a phone number or 2, but we're sending you on your way. They're not calling to check on them. They're not reaching out. And I wouldn't expect them to. So it's really cool that they have us in the hospitals to do this type of work. I think it's made a lot of changes.
So we have another question, and it's around recovery. So what is the best advice you can give to someone in recovery or has a close family or friend who is in recovery?
I think in my early recovery, at the start of my recovery, I had this notion that as soon as I stopped using, that my life was going to magically get better, and that I would have the same level of energy and happiness and fulfillment in my life that these people who I'd seen in peer groups with long-term recovery were experiencing. And I think people, have to be realistic about the fact that that's not the case. Recovery is amazing and it changes your entire life, but it's a lot of work and it's a never-ending process. Like we never achieve perfection, but are just striving for it every day as much as we can, and just to not give up on yourself. Believe that you're amazing and powerful and strong, and that this is an amazing learning experience, and you're going to get through it, find the other side.
I always heard something a guy said at meetings when I first started attending that resonated with me, and it's one thing I always try to remind people. And he had close to a decade of sobriety. He said, I need to remain teachable. And I think that alone gives you an extreme amount of power and room for growth, because once I get to feeling like I got this, I'm no longer seeking for an answer. You know what I mean? So if I get sober, maybe I still got some anger issues, maybe I still got some other things going on, but hey, I'm sober and I feel like I have nothing left yet to learn. I stopped seeking answers. I stopped looking for areas of improvement. And that's not to say I need to develop this perfectionism disease where I need to fix everything and constantly analyze myself, but it's just remaining teachable, keeping my eyes open and finding ways to make mini improvements while also accepting where I'm at. I feel like it's okay to not be okay is a great thing to tell someone in early recovery or recovery in general, because there's going to be days that are harder than others. There's going to be pain. There's going to be discomfort and boredom. And as addicts, we are programmed to seek fixing ourselves. We constantly need to take something to adjust how we feel, what we're thinking, how we're dealing with something. And not feeling okay is really amplified, especially in the beginning. So learning to just be okay with the not okay was massive to me personally and other people I've talked to.
So as we start to wind down, I have a question on how we can get involved. So we've heard the work you're doing, we've heard everything, the discussion and everything. So what can we do to get involved with SUD, OUD education, work, or volunteering?
I cannot speak for what's available in the Big Rapids area, but there are organizations that you can volunteer in You can attend more conferences like this. You can talk with people. I know more about harm reduction because I asked those questions and I was willing to listen to things that blow my mind, things that I just didn't ever understand or even know about. Grand Rapids Red Project has opportunities for volunteering. You can't really volunteer in SUD treatment programs. There are a ton of rules and regulations about that, but you can attend open meetings. You can look for opportunities that are about health. This does fall under a diagnosis, it falls under health. And so finding out more information, taking more trainings, becoming more aware, even if you're working in the business field, understanding mental health and substance use is really important because everybody around us, we all have mental health, and there's so many people who have substance use. And so understanding that, taking trainings, taking education pieces, volunteering, or just being around people and learning.
And anyone who's interested, I don't know how many of you in this meeting are in the Lucasta community, but we have a coalition that is currently being kind of run by 1016 called MOSAC, and that's going to be where we get together and put on prevention events for community members. We host sober social events for families and just kind of provide that prevention resources and information out to families and children. We also do things like purchase medical disposal boxes and things like that. And if you were interested in more information about that, Shay Teller is absolutely the expert in that area, and I'm sure would be happy to share with anyone who's interested.
And also continuing to educate yourself, but sharing what you are learning with someone else, and kind of what Susan was saying at the very beginning, to circle us all the way back to our keynote, being uncomfortable or being comfortable with those uncomfortable conversations, because you never know when you're just having these general talks or sharing what you've learned, who is that's going to impact. Because you don't know. I know my husband, he almost gets embarrassed sometimes because I'm the sex and drug lady at work, and I am vocal about it and I like to share. And he gets kind of shut down with that, like, please don't talk about your work, but you never know who it's going to impact. You never know kind of those seeds that you're planting in someone, because that person could be going through it, or that person could know someone who could benefit from that information. So being comfortable and sharing what you're learning, because it is important, and how else are we going to reduce stigma if we're not talking about it and not accepting that?
And really the best thing everybody can do is to just continue to educate themselves, continue to have these mini conversations with people in the community and your family, reducing the stigma, just trying to help take away some of this negative sting that comes along with substance use, because it's always just looked at as a behavior people are doing just because they want to or because they want to get high. And, we're starting to understand that there's so much more to that, and it may start out that way, but it turns into something else. And there's more than enough evidence to prove that. But just kind of, learning to have those hard conversations, and not to change people's mind, but just kind of advocating for it on a regular basis so they can see, and then talk about the changes. Like, there's a lot of recovery communities that are really adamant about being vocal in recovery. We shouldn't be locked in basements and keeping our lives secret. We don't have to run around and scream it to the world, oh, I'm in recovery, but just saying, like, yeah, I used to have some issues, and I made some changes, and this is how I did it. And that way it puts a face to the word recovery, and people don't just look at people as addicts or mess ups. They're like, okay, you're a person, you made some mistakes, and you've grown from them, and I just think the more conversations that could be had, the better.
Thank you for that. And then for those, Shay Teller put her contact information in the chat if you'd like to connect with her. So as we wrap up, are there any final comments, remarks that you would like to share with us regarding this topic?
I just want to say thank you for everybody who's attended, who's listening, who's asking questions, who is going to take one or two things I think one of the first questions is, what is the takeaway? The takeaway, I think, is to be honest and have conversations to decrease the stigma. So if we all have one conversation and then they have a conversation, and we can decrease the stigma and become more comfortable. I think that this is a great start. So thank you for everyone who attended.
Okay, so as we wrap up here, if there are any additional questions, please drop those into the chat. And if you think of things after we're finished with this session here, feel free to email us at CMREN, CMREN @ferris.edu. And we'll be happy to forward additional questions on to our speakers. Hopefully you are all okay with me volunteering you in that mechanism. First of all, just let me thank everyone who served on our panel here tonight. This has been an amazing conversation that really touches on so many different areas of substance use disorder and through different lenses, so that hopefully everyone here has taken away, quite a bit from this. I know that I certainly have. So thank you all for your contribution into the discussion tonight, and thank you to everyone for the questions. Now, I mentioned earlier, this is night one of a 2-night session. And so I want to highlight what's coming up tomorrow night from 6 to 8 p.m. And you're going to see some familiar faces here, and there's going to be a couple of new ones as well. So there's going to be breakout sessions co-occurring. So from 6 to 7, there will be one session, and from 7 to 8, there will be a second session that you are able to attend. And the session options are on the screen here, and certainly we can drop that link into the chat for you as well. The first session, I'll just kind of go in order here with what's on the screen. The first thing that we have here is at 6 o'clock, it's going to be War on Drugs, Historical Context to the War on Drugs. And this is really going to recall legislative action in the United States regarding drug use. It's going to identify key components of legislative action regarding drug use and discuss the impact of the war on drugs on people and populations. The next thing we have here is substance use disorder is not a one-size-fits-all. And that's a deep dive into harm reduction, syringe service programs, and the most recent data that we have to support our discussion and what you can do to best serve your community, which I know is one of the questions that was asked tonight. The next one here is the crucial conversations with a peer recovery coach. And so this is an interactive session where you'll be asked to engage in conversation, ask questions, offer alternative perspectives to what you think addiction and recovery is, and then what resources are best used to help those in our community who still struggle with active addiction. So those will be the co-occurring 6 p.m. sessions. And then from 7 to 8, we have a couple more here, starting with Reversing the Stigma, Understanding the Importance of Naloxone Accessibility and Distribution, where the goal is to discover the various challenges faced by our society to increase naloxone accessibility and distribution, and to break down the stigma and misconceptions surrounding naloxone use. And then last but certainly not least is Addiction is a Family Disease. This is Professor Lori Zolkowski, where we will learn how her daughter's overdose, battle with addiction, and recovery affected the whole family. This journey was filled with worry, guilt, and grief, but also with knowledge, resources, and support. They were able to heal as a family and implement programs to help others like Hope Not Handcuffs, Comeback Quick Response Teams, and family recovery coaching. So please, if you are able to, join us again tomorrow. We would love to see you in these breakout sessions where we can really do a deeper dive into these topics that we've mentioned here. And then lastly, we really want some feedback on how you were impacted and what your thoughts are with these educational sessions, both night 1 and 2. So there is a link on the screen here, and I will drop that into the chat as well so that it's easier to copy and paste. But I just want to point out that if you will not be able to join us again tomorrow, please take this link and just mention that you attended night 1. If you will be back tomorrow, we would love to see you again. Go ahead and wait until, excuse me, go ahead and wait until the conclusion of tomorrow evening, and then you can check both boxes 1 and 2. And that link is here in the chat now. So thank you all for joining us tonight. And as I mentioned, if there are more questions or future questions that you think of, please reach out to us and we'll pass them along for you.
And then I did see in the chat that if there's any way to forward the PowerPoint presentation that was shown today via email. So this session was recorded. This session will go on to our YouTube page for everyone to be able to view. You'll be able to see everything that we discussed today, as well as the PowerPoint presentation. So thank you all again. Have a great night, and we hope to see you again tomorrow.